She's a little thing, isn't she? Probably lost on her way to the library, the crowd laughed. The small woman at the end of the bar gave no reaction, her gaze fixed on the condensation, tracing a path down her glass of water. But when the retired admiral pushed through the swinging doors an hour later and saw the impossible aftermath, he didn't see a little thing. He saw a ghost from his past, a weapon forged in the darkest corners of the world, standing in the posture of perfect, lethal calm. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to raise its voice, type competence below. The bar was called The Anchor, a name that promised stability but delivered only the slow, sinking feeling of a Tuesday night in a forgotten port town. The air was thick with the ghosts of spilled beer, stale cigarette smoke baked into the wood paneling from a decade prior, and the low hum of regret. Neon signs, buzzing like dying insects, cast a jaundiced glow on the faces of the patrons, each nursing their own quiet desperation. At the far end of the scuffed mahogany bar, isolated by a deliberate cushion of empty stools, sat the woman. She was unremarkable by design, a study in deliberate anonymity. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, severe knot, revealing a face devoid of makeup, a face that held a stillness that was both unnerving and invisible. She was small, yes, her frame lean and compact, swallowed by a plain gray hoodie and worn jeans. The only thing that hinted at a world beyond this one was the watch on her wrist, a rugged black tactical timepiece with a compass and altimeter, its face scratched from encounters with surfaces far rougher than this splintered bar top. She had been there for an hour, nursing the same glass of water, her posture unchanging. She was an island of perfect stillness in a sea of sloshing, boisterous noise, a pocket of silence that seemed to bend the room's chaotic energy around it. Her name was Sloane, a name as clipped and functional as her movements. She was on a mandatory 72-hour stand-down, a forced decompression after an operation whose details were already sublimating into classified memory, leaving behind only the phantom weight of her gear and the lingering taste of recycled air. The Anchor was chosen for its profound lack of character, a place where she could simply be a ghost, unobserved and unbothered. The universe, however, had other plans, and they arrived in the form of a man named Rick Deckard. Deckard was the kind of man who took up too much space, his voice a booming instrument of self-importance that filled every corner of the room. A former high school quarterback whose glory had faded but whose arrogance had calcified, he moved through the bar like he owned it, followed by a wake of two sycophantic friends who laughed too loudly at his jokes. He was big, thick-necked, and wore his faded football championship ring like a crown. His life had peaked at 18, and he'd spent the subsequent decade punishing the world for it, especially the transient military personnel from the nearby Naval Special Warfare Base, whom he viewed with a potent cocktail of envy and contempt. They were a constant, disciplined reminder of a world of purpose he could never access. So he chose his targets carefully, preying on those he perceived as weak, those who wouldn't or couldn't fight back, asserting his petty dominance in the only arena he had left. And tonight his eyes landed on the small, silent woman at the end of the bar. To him, she was an easy mark, an embodiment of everything he wasn't: quiet, contained, and female. He saw her stillness not as discipline, but as fear. He saw her solitude not as a choice, but as a weakness. His initial comment, the one about the library, had been a probe, a way to test the waters. The laughter from his friends and the nervous chuckles from the surrounding tables emboldened him. He swaggered over, his friends in tow, and leaned his heavy forearm on the bar next to her, invading her space. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he slurred, his breath a foul mix of cheap whiskey and entitlement. Sloane didn't move. Her eyes remained on her glass, her focus absolute. This infuriated him. In his world, his presence demanded acknowledgement. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" He sneered, nudging her stool with his boot. "Or are you just rude?" Still nothing. Not a flinch. Not a flicker of an eye. It was as if he were a phantom, a noisy ghost she refused to acknowledge. The silence was a wall he couldn't breach, and it drove him to a familiar, brutish tactic. With a theatrical sigh of exasperation, he picked up his half-full beer mug and accidentally tipped it, sending a cascade of amber liquid splashing across her lap and the floor. "Whoops," he said, the sarcasm thick in his voice. "Clumsy me." The room went quiet for a beat, the patrons watching, waiting. This was the moment of confrontation. This was where the small woman was supposed to cry, or yell, or shrink away, validating Deckard's power. Sloane finally moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. She blinked once. Then her gaze lifted from her glass, traveling up his thick arm, past his smug face, and met his eyes in the mirror behind the bar. There was no anger in her expression, no fear. There was nothing. It was the calm, dispassionate gaze of geologists studying a rock, and in that vacant assessment, Deckard felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. He had expected a reaction, any reaction, but this profound, analytical emptiness was something new. He mistook it for submission, a final, silent surrender before the inevitable retreat. He was wrong. It was not surrender. It was targeting. She was calculating angles, assessing threats, and cataloging the exits. The silence wasn't passive. It was active, a tactical pause before a decision was made. The air in the anchor grew heavier, the jukebox seeming to fade into the background as the confrontation drew every eye. Deckard, misreading her calm as a victory, pressed his advantage. He felt the need to punctuate his dominance with a final, public act of humiliation. His friends, flanking him like dull-witted gargoyles, snickered in anticipation. One of them, a lanky man named Jimmy, chimed in, "Guess she's not much of a talker, Rick. Maybe she needs some help finding the door." The suggestion hung in the air, a threat wrapped in a thin veil of concern. The bartender, a weary man named Sal who had seen 1,000 nights like this, began to polish a glass with a little too much vigor, his eyes darting nervously between the woman and the exit. He knew Deckard's type. He knew this could get ugly, but intervening was a risk he wasn't paid enough to take. Deckard's ego, now fully inflated, demanded a physical response. Words were no longer enough. He needed to move her, to physically displace her from his space, his bar, his town. He reached out, his thick fingers aiming to grab her by the arm, to haul her off the stool and propel her toward the door. "All right, library hours are over," he grunted, his hand closing in on her shoulder. The moment his fingers made contact with the fabric of her hoodie, the atmosphere in the bar didn't just change, it fractured. It was as if a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside the woman, a system transitioning from dormant to active in less than a microsecond. The air itself seemed to cool, to thin, as if all the ambient energy in the room was being drawn into the small, still point she occupied. The world, for a brief, eternal moment, seemed to slow down. Her movement was not a reaction. It was an answer. It was a fluid, undeniable statement of physics and intent. It began not with her hands, but with her core. As his fingers tightened, her body flowed with the pressure, not against it. She didn't resist his pull. She guided it, using his own forward momentum to her advantage. Her left foot slid back a mere inch on the greasy floor, her center of gravity dropping almost imperceptibly. Her right hand, which had been resting calmly on the bar, came up in a blur, not to strike, but to intercept. Her palm met his wrist, not with a slap, but with a precise, calculated impact. Her fingers wrapped around the radial nerve bundle with the casual expertise of a surgeon. A jolt, like 1,000 volts of ice, shot up Deckard's arm. His fingers, which had been clamped on her shoulder, went numb and uncoiled instantly. A strangled gasp escaped his lips, his brain struggling to process the sudden, blinding pain that had erupted from a simple touch. He tried to pull back, but her grip was like a steel clamp. The sequence that followed was not a fight. A fight implies a contest, a struggle between two parties. This was a demonstration. It was a lesson in biomechanics delivered with brutal, impersonal efficiency. As Deckard recoiled in pain, his friend Jimmy, seeing his leader falter, decided to be a hero. He lunged forward from the side, his arms outstretched to grab her. Sloane didn't even seem to look at him. Her head remained oriented toward Deckard, but her peripheral awareness was absolute. As Jimmy entered her space, her left elbow shot backward in a tight, precise arc, connecting with his floating ribs. It wasn't a powerful blow in the traditional sense. It was a perfectly placed one. The sound was a dull, wet thud like a hammer hitting a side of beef. All the air rushed out of Jimmy's lungs in a pained whoosh. His eyes widened in shock, and he folded it on himself, collapsing to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The third man, a heavy-set individual named Carl, froze mid-step, his brain finally catching up to the reality of the situation. He saw his two friends neutralized in the span of 2 seconds by a woman half their size. His bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal, intelligent fear. He raised his hands in a gesture of universal surrender and took a slow, deliberate step backward. Sloane had not wasted a single motion. Her entire economy of movement was a testament to thousands of hours of training, a muscle memory so deeply ingrained it was instinct. With Jimmy handled, her attention returned to Deckard, who was still trying to yank his arm free. She tightened her grip on his wrist, stepped forward, and flowed under his arm, placing him in a simple, inescapable lock. With a final controlled twist, she drove him to his knees. His other hand flew to the floor to brace his fall, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. The silence that fell over the anchor was no longer tense. It was absolute. It was a deafening, profound silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. The jukebox seemed to have short-circuited. The low murmur of conversations had vanished. Every single person in the bar was frozen, their eyes locked on the scene. They had all seen the same thing, but their minds refused to accept it. The small, quiet woman was now standing calmly over the town's biggest bully, who was kneeling on the floor, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His two friends were out of the picture, one wheezing on the ground and the other looking as if he'd seen a ghost. The entire event, from the moment Deckard touched her to the moment he hit his knees, had taken less than 5 seconds. Sloane released his wrist. She didn't push him away or offer a parting insult. She simply let go. The transaction was complete. She turned, retrieved her still full glass of water from the bar, and took a small sip, her composure utterly undisturbed. It was as if she had just finished a particularly tedious bit of paperwork. Deckard, cradling his wrist, stared up at her, his arrogance completely shattered, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He was looking at something he couldn't comprehend. This wasn't a lucky shot. It wasn't a fluke. It was a level of competence so far beyond his understanding that it felt like magic, a dark and terrifying magic. He had poked a hornet's nest and discovered it was, in fact, a sleeping dragon. The bartender, Sal, finally unfroze. His hand, shaking slightly, reached for the old rotary phone behind the counter. He didn't know who to call. The police, an ambulance, or an exorcist. He settled on the police, his voice a reedy whisper as he reported a disturbance. The other patrons slowly began to breathe again, their minds racing to recontextualize what they had just witnessed. They looked at the woman differently now. Her silence was no longer meekness, it was patience. Her small frame was no longer a sign of weakness. It was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of camouflage. They had been laughing at a predator, secure in their ignorance, and the sudden, violent revelation of their mistake left them feeling cold and exposed. The legend of this night was already beginning to form in their minds, a story they would tell for years, a story that would grow with each telling, but one that could never quite capture the sheer, silent efficiency of the truth they had just seen. The wail of a siren in the distance was the first sound to pierce the heavy blanket of silence. It grew steadily closer, a harbinger of official intervention. But even the law felt inadequate to address what had happened here. This was something older, something more fundamental than laws. This was a raw, unfiltered lesson about assumptions. It was a lesson about the vast, hidden depths that can lie behind a quiet face. And it was a lesson that Rick Deckard, kneeling on the sticky floor of the anchor, would never, ever forget. His world had been turned upside down not by a punch, but by a touch. His reign of petty tyranny had been ended not with a shout, but with a whisper of movement. In the aftermath of the impossible 5-second confrontation, the bar remained a tableau of suspended animation. Sloane stood by her stool, a pillar of calm in the wreckage of Deckard's ego. She hadn't moved to the other side of the room, nor did she press any advantage. The threat had been neutralized, and for her, the event was over. Her posture was relaxed but alert, a state of being known in her world as condition yellow, a constant, low-level awareness of her surroundings. Her gaze wasn't fixed on the defeated men, but was instead sweeping the room in a slow, methodical pattern, cataloging faces, exits, and potential secondary threats. It was an unconscious habit, as natural to her as breathing. The two local police officers who entered first were young, products of a town where the biggest disturbances were usually drunken brawls between fishermen. They saw the scene and made the most logical and most incorrect assumption. They saw two men on the floor, a third looking terrified, and a small, unassuming woman standing nearby. Their training kicked in, a rigid flowchart of procedure that was ill-equipped for this level of nuance. "All right, what's going on here?" The first officer, a young man named Peterson, said, his voice straining for an authority he didn't quite feel. His hand rested on his sidearm, a gesture of ingrained habit rather than genuine threat assessment. His partner fanned out, beginning to talk to the wide-eyed patrons, whose stories would surely sound like drunken exaggeration. Sal, the bartender, just pointed a trembling finger. "Her," he croaked. "It was her." Peterson turned his full attention to Sloane. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands on the bar and don't move." Sloane's expression didn't change. She simply complied, placing her palms flat on the sticky surface of the bar. It was a gesture of cooperation, but there was no submission in it. She moved with a liquid grace that seemed to mock the very idea of her being a threat. It was at that moment that a third figure entered the bar, stepping through the door with an air of quiet authority that the two younger officers could only hope to one day possess. He was an older man, tall and lean, with a shock of white hair and eyes the color of a winter sea. He wore a simple civilian jacket, but he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a lifelong commander. This was retired Admiral James Vance. Vance had been a pillar of the naval special warfare community for 40 years before retiring to this quiet town. He knew more about creating and deploying human weapons than anyone alive. He had been at a nearby restaurant. When he heard the call go out over the scanner, he still monitored out of habit. A disturbance at the anchor was common, but something in the dispatcher's voice, a note of confusion, had piqued his interest. He walked into the bar, and his eyes, trained to assess complex situations in a fraction of a second, took in everything. He saw Deckard, whom he knew by reputation as a local nuisance, clutching his wrist. He saw the other man on the floor, struggling for breath. He saw the terrified third friend. Then he saw the woman, and he stopped. His mind, a vast archive of faces, files, and after-action reports, began to spin. He didn't recognize her face, but he recognized her type. It was in the stance, feet shoulder-width apart, weight perfectly balanced, a posture that was both relaxed and coiled, ready to spring into action from a dead stop. It was in the unnerving calm, the complete absence of adrenaline's frantic energy. Most of all, it was in her eyes. He had seen those eyes before, in the faces of the young men he had sent into the darkest places on Earth. They were old eyes, ancient eyes that had seen too much and judged the world on a brutal, binary calculus of threat and non-threat. Officer Peterson, oblivious to the Admiral's presence, was about to cuff the woman. "You're under arrest for assault," he declared, pulling out his handcuffs. "Hold on, son." Vance's voice cut through the room, calm but carrying an immense weight. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Peterson froze, turning to see the Admiral. Everyone in town knew who Admiral Vance was. His word carried more weight than any local ordinance. "Admiral," Peterson stammered, surprised. "We've got this under control." Vance ignored him, his gaze locked on Sloane. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes scanning for details. He saw the functional watch. He saw the calluses on her knuckles, faint but undeniable. He saw a tiny wisp of a tattoo peeking out from under the collar of her hoodie, just the very top of a trident. His breath caught in his chest. It couldn't be. He stopped a few feet from her. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked, his voice quiet, respectful. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was low and clear, devoid of emotion. "Sloane," Vance nodded slowly. The name meant nothing but the tattoo, the stance, the impossible result lying on the floor. It all pointed to a conclusion so improbable it had to be true. He turned to Officer Peterson. "Son, give me your radio." Peterson, confused but intimidated, handed it over. Vance keyed the mic and spoke into it, his voice changing, shedding the folksy retiree and adopting the crisp, authoritative tone of a commander. "This is Vance. I need you to patch me through to a secure line. Authorization code Victor Alpha 977. Priority 1" the dispatcher, recognizing the Admiral's voice and the high-level authorization code, complied immediately. The radio crackled, and a new, secure channel opened. Vance turned his back slightly to the room, shielding the radio, and spoke again, his voice now a low murmur. "This is Admiral Vance, retired. I'm at a civilian location with an individual I believe to be an active operator. Last name, Sloan. I need confirmation of status and unit." Now, there was a pause on the other end, then the sound of frantic typing. Vance waited, his eyes never leaving the woman. He was watching for her reaction. She gave none. She simply stood there, patient, as if this were all just another layer of protocol to be navigated. The voice came back over the radio, tinny and laced with awe. "Sir, we have a match. Commander Maya Sloan. Call sign Echo attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Her status is active, sir." Tier 1 the words hung in the air, a litany of impossibilities. Development Group, the official, unclassified name for the unit more commonly known by its former designation, SEAL Team 6. Tier 1, the absolute tip of the spear, the most elite, clandestine, and lethal fighting force in the United States military. These were the operators sent on missions that were never spoken of in places that didn't officially exist. And Commander was a rank that took decades of exemplary service and leadership to achieve. Vance's face, already stern, hardened into a mask of profound respect. He turned back to the room. He handed the radio back to a pale and wide-eyed Officer Peterson. He then faced Sloan, stood up ramrod straight, and executed a perfect, formal salute. "Commander Sloan," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced every thought in the room. "My apologies for the interruption to your evening. The sight of the legendary Admiral saluting the small, quiet woman was a cognitive bomb that detonated in the mind of every person present." Officer Peterson's jaw hung open. Deckard, still on his knees, stared in utter, soul-crushing disbelief. The library? He had taunted one of the most dangerous women on the planet about going to the library. The shame was a physical force pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. Vance lowered his salute and addressed the stunned officers. "This woman," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "is a decorated hero who has sacrificed more for this country than any of us could possibly imagine. The fact that she is standing here, and these three idiots are still breathing, is a testament to a level of professional restraint that is, frankly, astonishing." He gestured to Deckard and his friends. "Arrest them, drunk and disorderly. Assault, whatever you can make stick. Their evening is over. Commander Sloan's is just getting started." Vance then turned to Sal. "Whatever her tab is, put on mine." For the rest of her life, the validation was complete. It was official, undeniable, and absolute. The quiet professional had been revealed, not by her own words, but by the irrefutable evidence of her competence and the reverent testimony of a man who understood its true meaning. The mystery of her skill was solved, and in its place was a new, more profound mystery. The mystery of a life lived in the shadows, a life of quiet service, a life so far removed from the petty squabbles of a Tuesday night bar that its brief intersection with their world felt like a visit from another dimension. Sloan, for her part, simply gave the Admiral a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement between peers, a silent understanding that transcended words. The crisis was over. Order, in its truest sense, had been restored. The story of what happened at the Anchor did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the town with the speed of gossip and the force of myth. In the barracks at the nearby naval base, it became an instant legend, whispered in hushed, reverent tones. The initial reports were fragmented, passed from the dispatcher to a friend, from one of the young cops to his partner, from a patron who stumbled home, and woke his wife to tell her what he'd seen. At first, the details were fuzzy and exaggerated. Some said she had fought off 10 men. Others claimed she had never moved from her stool, disabling them with her mind. But as the core facts were solidified by the undeniable presence of Admiral Vance and the subsequent, quiet disappearance of all official reports on the incident, the story settled into its true, more terrifying form. It wasn't about a wild brawl. It was about a surgical application of force, a display of skill so profound it defied conventional understanding. The name Sloan became a code word on the base, a shorthand for the ultimate quiet professional. Young sailors, puffed up with the pride of their new uniforms, were told the story by grizzled chief petty officers as a cautionary tale. "You see that quiet guy in the corner?" they would say. "You see that woman who looks like she wouldn't hurt a fly? You have no idea who they are or what they've done. You show them respect. You always show respect." The story became a living piece of institutional memory, a modern fable about the dangers of assumption. For Rick Deckard, the aftermath was a crucible of humiliation. He was charged with disorderly conduct and assault, a slap on the wrist legally, but the social consequences were devastating. He became a pariah in a town that had once been his kingdom. The friends who had once orbited him now avoided his calls. The deference he had commanded through intimidation was gone, replaced by whispers and mocking stares. He couldn't enter the Anchor or any other bar without feeling the weight of 100 eyes, all of them remembering him on his knees, defeated by a woman he had dismissed as a little thing. This public shaming forced him into a place he had never been before: introspection. He had to confront the brittle foundation of his own identity. His arrogance had been a shield, protecting a deep-seated insecurity about his own life's trajectory. That shield had been shattered. He had two choices: crumble into bitterness or rebuild. Weeks later, humbled and sober, he walked onto the naval base and enlisted. It was a shocking move, one that no one could have predicted. He chose the most difficult path he could find, seeking not glory, but discipline. He was hoping to find, in the rigid structure and humbling anonymity of the military, a piece of the quiet strength he had witnessed that night. It was his penance, and his only path to redemption. Sloan, meanwhile, remained a ghost. Her 72-hour stand-down ended, and she vanished back into the classified world from which she had come. She never returned to the Anchor. She sought no recognition, no thanks. The event, for her, was a minor, regrettable anomaly, a brief and unwelcome deviation from the controlled silence of her life. Yet, her brief appearance left an indelible mark. The bar itself became a local landmark. Tourists and sailors would come in and ask Sal, "Is this the place?" And which stool was she sitting at? Sal, in a stroke of marketing genius, left the stool empty, roping it off with a piece of velvet rope and placing a small, handwritten sign on it that read, "Reserved." He never explained for whom, but everyone knew. It was the quiet professional's chair. Admiral Vance made it a point to visit the bar once a week. He would sit at a booth, order a drink, and look over at the empty stool. He saw it as a monument, not to violence, but to restraint. He had seen the official file. He knew what Sloan was capable of. He knew that the force she had used on Deckard was less than 1% of her capacity. It was the equivalent of a nuclear bomb being used to light a candle. Her true demonstration of skill that night wasn't in her ability to fight. It was in her decision not to kill, not to maim, not to destroy. It was the discipline to use the absolute minimum amount of force necessary to de-escalate a threat. That, to Vance, was the mark of a true warrior. The legend grew, and, as it did, it began to serve a greater purpose. It became a teaching tool. Vance himself used it when he would guest lecture at the Naval Academy. He would tell the story to rooms full of bright-eyed, ambitious midshipmen, hammering home the core lesson. "Your capabilities mean nothing without character," he would boom, his voice echoing in the lecture hall. "Your strength is worthless without wisdom. The loudest voice in the room is often the weakest. True power is quiet. It is calm. It is the ability to do anything, and the wisdom to do only what is necessary." Remember Commander Sloan. Remember the lesson of the Anchor. The story changed people. It changed the way the town interacted with the base. A new undercurrent of respect flowed between the civilian and military populations. The old, easy arrogance was replaced by a more cautious, more curious humility. People started to wonder about the quiet ones, about the stories they might carry, about the worlds hidden behind their unassuming faces. The ripple effect of that one night, that one demonstration of quiet competence, was a slow but steady cultural shift, a recalibration of what it meant to be strong. It was a legacy built not on a statue or a plaque, but on a changed perspective, a lesson passed down in the form of a story that reminded everyone that the most dangerous people are the ones who have nothing to prove. They're the ones who have already proven it, over and over again, in silence and in shadow. A full year passed. The seasons in the port town turned, bringing with them the familiar cycle of summer tourists and winter gales. The story of the incident at the Anchor had, by now, fully integrated itself into the fabric of local folklore. It was told and retold, embellished in some places, but the core truth of it remained a powerful and respected lesson. At the naval base, a new class of recruits was going through their initial training. Among them was Rick Deckard. He was leaner now, harder. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He was older than most of the other recruits, and he carried a weight they couldn't understand. He excelled. His instructors noted his singular drive, his almost fanatical devotion to discipline. He never spoke of his past, but it was there in his eyes, a constant reminder of the man he used to be and the man he was trying to become. He was, in his own way, chasing the ghost of Commander Sloan, trying to build within himself the kind of quiet strength that had so completely dismantled his world. One afternoon, during a hand-to-hand combat training session, Deckard found himself paired with a cocky young recruit who reminded him painfully of his former self. The recruit was all bluster and raw, undisciplined strength. He taunted Deckard about his age, trying to get a rise out of him. Deckard remained silent. When the sparring began, he didn't meet the recruit's aggression with equal force. Instead, he used the man's own momentum against him, redirecting his lunges, using precise, controlled movements to put him on the ground without causing injury. He used the absolute minimum effort required. After pinning the recruit for the third time, he helped him to his feet. The young man looked at him with a new, grudging respect. "How'd you do that?" he asked, breathing heavily. Deckard looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, he offered a piece of his own hard-won wisdom. "You're too loud," he said simply. "You telegraph everything you're going to do. The real danger isn't the guy who's yelling. It's the one you don't even see." The lesson had come full circle. The humbled had become the teacher. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in a dusty, sun-bleached landscape that did not appear on any official map, Commander Sloan was preparing for another mission. She moved through the pre-op checklist with the same methodical calm she had displayed in the bar. Her focus was absolute, her mind a clean, cold instrument of purpose. The incident at the Anchor was a distant, faded memory, a footnote in a life defined by far more significant events. She would never know the profound impact her actions had on a small town and the lives of the people in it. She would never know that her restraint had redeemed a man, or that her silence had become a lesson for a new generation of warriors. That was the nature of her service. Her victories were anonymous, her sacrifices unseen. Her legacy was not in the stories told about her, but in the world that continued to turn, blissfully unaware of the silent professionals who stood watch on its darkest frontiers. Her worth was not defined by the medals she wore, most of which were locked in a vault she would never see again, but by her unwavering adherence to a code of quiet competence. The world celebrated the loud, the visible, the self-promoting. But the world was protected by the silent, the invisible, the professionals who let their actions speak for them. This is the enduring truth of the quiet professional. Their power lies not in their presence, but in their impact. Their legacy is not a name carved in stone, but a standard of excellence that inspires others to be better, to be stronger, to be quieter. It is the understanding that true respect is not demanded. It is earned in silence, through deeds, not words. It is a legacy that doesn't need a monument, because it lives on in the changed hearts and minds of those who were fortunate enough to witness it, a ripple of competence spreading outward from a single, quiet act. True strength isn't about the noise you make. It's about the silence you command. It's about the calm you maintain when the world is chaos. It's about a competence so profound that it needs no announcement, no validation, no applause. It simply is, and in a world that grows louder and more arrogant by the day, it is that quiet, disciplined, professional competence that holds the line. The empty stool at the anchor stands as a silent testament to this truth, a quiet memorial to an invisible hero, and a powerful reminder that you should never, ever judge a person by their size, their gender, or their silence. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where professional restraint defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.